All right, I've got a great show for you guys today. I have two experts when it comes to what's going on in the United States, what's going on with China, the real story about China. I want to thank James and Bradley for coming on the show. Thank you guys so much for coming on today.
Well, Stephen, thank you for having us. It's our great pleasure to join you today.
All right. Well, I appreciate you guys coming on. We want to talk about embracing communist China. Let me give a little bit of background on each of you, just so my audience knows who they're listening to. Jim is a retired U.S. Navy captain, serving 29 years in the military. He's a former director of intelligence and information operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, government fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China. Brad is a PhD and is a founding member of the Committee of Present Danger China and a former visiting fellow of Magdalen College and the University of Oxford. The big story in the news right now, and I'll direct this first at Jim. The United States just passed this $95 billion foreign aid package in the House, money for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. However, some members of Senate are trying to justify the large amount of money going to Ukraine because they say if the United States loses Ukraine, it will signal China that it's okay to make a move on Taiwan and the rest of the world. What are your thoughts on those comments?
Well, I've been a little bit critical of the bill because the speaker last October, the new speaker, had made comments regarding his, commitment to not just having an unregulated spending bill that wasn't having some better controls to accountability for what was being sent to the Ukraine. And then also he said he would link it with border security because we have clearly a problem in the southern border with the Chinese coming across amongst many other millions. So I'm a little bit worried that we have people that say one thing to get into a position of power and then do something different. I don't like that. That's not the way I was raised. It's not the way I lived in the U.S. military. Your word is your bond. So that's troubling to me. But the concept of do we need to make sure that we hold the line on Putin and the Russians and not give Xi any ideas about the American weakness to take Taiwan, I think there's some validity there. So we have to fight the Taiwan, or we have to make sure that we are holding the line against Putin. I would say that we probably could have done a lot more before the invasion. And that's one of the purposes of our book and our thesis is we didn't deter Putin, even though he invaded in 2014 Crimea, even though he had invaded Georgia in 2008. We had these, indicators that are very clear and unambiguous of what Putin wants to do. And we, the United States government, didn't deter him, either Democrats or Republicans. So only Trump came in and actually provided some offensive weapons when he was president. So we have a problem when we don't understand what deterrence means. And so I get it that we should be doing something to stop Putin in the Ukraine, but we also need to stop the bloodshed. But we also have much more complex relationships, which is basically China is keeping Russia afloat by buying their oil. And when oil is, as expensive it is now, they're getting lots of money. So there's other things we could do as a nation to defang Putin by taking and cutting them off from access to money. Why aren't we doing that? So it's very complex, but the general thesis that weakness breeds aggression, there's a truism there. And so we need to be strong, but it's not something you can just isolate and use as a soundbite to justify a spending bill and then not really do anything to deter the PRC, which I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail.
Yes. I just recently had Professor Victor Davis Hanson on, and he said, deterrence is difficult to establish and easy to lose. And part of my worry is that we've pushed Russia into the arms of China, and China basically around the Olympics signed off on this incursion into Ukraine. Brad, what are your thoughts on that as far as the new money that's being sent in foreign aid, as well as has this war in Ukraine pushed Russia into the arms of China?
Look, this is a strategic misstep. It's a strategic misstep when we understand that strategy is about making difficult choices. It's about prioritizing threats. The CCP is the existential threat to the United States. Putin is not an existential threat. The CCP wants to kill us, and they're doing everything that they can do to undermine us internally, to shift elements of put our alliances under strain. They're preparing to aggress against Taiwan. They're committing a genocide in Xinjiang. They've crushed democracy in Hong Kong. This is a hyper-aggressive regime, which is motivated by a communist ideology, which is intent in killing the United States. And so when we understand that, and it's so the intent is there, and it's wedded to capabilities which have grown prodigiously in terms of military capabilities, cyber, nuclear, conventional capabilities, as well as their aggressive diplomatic measures, technological measures, etc. So strategy dictates that we have to husband our resources against the Chinese Communist Party. That's the center of gravity where our efforts have to be made. Everything else, in a sense, is a luxury strategically. Now, Ukraine is a humanitarian disaster. What's happened in the Middle East is a disaster. It should not have happened, but to large measure, it's driven by the Chinese Communist Party, which has opened the strategic space for Putin to act. Stephen, you mentioned at the outset, right, that the Olympics meeting where Xi and Putin met and where Putin was given the green light, he was told that the Chinese Communist Party would back him up if he invaded Ukraine. Well, that's a very important development. And then the subsequent meetings where the no limits partnership was set, right, where the CCP continues to support him militarily, diplomatically, economically. So when we recognize that, we see what Ronald Reagan identified in his March 1983 speech as the Soviet Communist Party was the center of evil in the modern world, and it had to be confronted and it had to be defeated. So too, we need to recognize that has to be our energy. Now, I would feel much better if there were money and if there were energy, and if you, as to borrow an nautical phrase from Jim's Navy, a fair wind and a following sea behind a strategy to attack the CCP. But there's not. Stephen, we're still in the headlock. We're still captured by what we term the engagement school, which is determined to work with the CCP. That is, have US elites, business elites, political elites work with the CCP. So this money spent on Ukraine is the motivation we can understand, but that's money that we need. That's money that Taiwan needs. That's money that needs to be, that could go to the Indo-Pacific to help deterrence, which is the key thing. We do not want war to begin. The CCP is determined to attack Taiwan. And what we must do now, our highest priority is to kill the CCP as they want to kill us, and to take every measure to defeat their intent, their aggressive intents, which is their immediate priority is Taiwan. So deterrence of an attack against Taiwan is absolutely critical. And that's where our energy should be. A final point, Jim well knows, given his long experience in Navy intel, that US government can focus on only a few things. It only has so much bandwidth. And Ukraine, Middle East, other issues are taking up that bandwidth. And too little is given to what Jim calls the main thing, which is the Chinese Communist Party and the aggression of the PRC. And that's a tremendous danger that undermines deterrence and that undermines our position in the world. So when we reflect on that, strategy dictates prioritization about what matters for American national security interests. And it will also compels us to recognize the enemy that we have, who has a knife at our throat, which is the Chinese Communist Party. So those are my reflections. Thank you.
Okay. Jim, back to you. Feel free to elaborate on what Brad said, but first I wanted to ask, I've had several former military higher ups on the show, and they've kind of alluded to this idea that ever since Ronald Reagan, Putin and Russia have been this boogeyman in order to justify the military budget. But it does seem like they focus a lot on Russia, but aren't willing to call out China. They're not willing to call them out. Is that because we have such deep trading relationships with China as opposed to Russia? Or what are your thoughts on this not willing to call China the same boogeyman that they call Russia?
Well, that's exactly right. We have a totally different view of Russia than we do of the PRC. And, I don't have a problem calling Putin and Russia a bad actor in their neighborhood. They launching a war against Ukraine is despicable. You can't justify it. But in the same sense, and we had, I think it was a couple of months ago, you had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan go on the Sunday talk shows when they sanctioned 500 additional Russian companies. And he said, hey, we gotta do this. And they said, well, why are you doing it now? Why did you wait 2.5 years into the administration to do this? And he says, well, it's important because we got to cut off Russia from money. And then you're like, well, okay, so if that's true, then why aren't we decoupling from the PRC, who's got 350 ICBM silos in central and western China filled with the DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missile with, maybe 6 to 10 nuclear warheads pointed at us? Why are we funding that? Why are we funding the largest Navy in the world that grew in the last 25 years? Why are we funding their operational tempo so that they can fly around Taiwan every day or have carriers sailing east of Taiwan? Why are we doing that? So we haven't been able to tell and call China out for what they are, that what Brad described in his first answer. And that's the thesis of our book, which is, why did this happen? And it happened for a lot of reasons, but primarily it happened because it happened for 3 reasons. But the first one is generally because of this time period in the end of the Cold War, we kind of got a hubris in America and said, we don't have a threat. The Russians, the Soviets are gone, and we can rule the world ourselves. Now, we didn't say it that way, but there was kind of that approach to it. And then the second thing is we had people in Wall Street and Silicon Valley that said, I want to make money, and so I'm going to go make money, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make money, and I don't care who I do the deal with, even if it's the devil in the PRC. And then lastly is this guy Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader of China, and in 1989 when he opened up their economy, and he understood us better than we understood ourselves, and he was able to play on our weaknesses, our greed, our avarice, our arrogance, and he used that to infiltrate the U.S. government. And over that period of time, from 89, if you will, to 91, whatever you want to date you want to pick, but from that time on, the last 30 plus years, almost 40 years, we've had people that have embraced engagement. And then we did it for, kind of reasons to get after the Soviet Union in the early 70s when Nixon and Kissinger went. But by the time Tiananmen rolls around, people should have been questioning, why are we dealing with a communist regime that kills its own people? But instead of asking those questions, we went into hyperdrive on engagement. And we convinced ourselves that by engaging, the Chinese will accept international norms, the post-World War II international norms that we, America, largely created with our allies. And we said they'll come along and they'll be like us and they'll recognize this is beneficial to them. And that means that we fundamentally misunderstood Chinese communism and that they really hated us and want to do what Brad described, destroy us. And so because of that, all these engagers in our government and the think tanks and the State Department and in the DOD and our administrations all pushed engagement for engagement's sake. And no one ever sat back and said, hold on a minute, engagement's supposed to make things better, but here we are 30, 40 years later, and things are demonstrably worse. So why are we continuing to engage? And it was only during the Trump administration that we had finally a first administration that broke with that. And they said, why are we engaging? And, former Secretary of State Pompeo talked about blind engagement or engagement for engagement's sake. We questioned it and we said, no, we're going to deal from a policy of realpolitik and power politics, and we're not going to just blindly accept engagement. Didn't mean they would never talk to the Chinese. President Trump talked to the Chinese routinely, but it didn't mean that he was naive and stupid and just went along with doing engagement for engagement's sake. There was a purpose, there was a reason. And that's largely what's been taken out of our country or infiltrated our government and taken out our will to defend ourselves. And then that created this engagement school, as Brad mentioned, where you had just people were constantly pushing it. And that created another thing that we talk about, which is threat deflation, where we constantly had government agencies, especially in the intelligence community and in the DoD, where we kind of said, well, that's not really a threat, don't worry about it, or they're not that capable, or they have not fought a war since 1979 with Vietnam, so they're really not that good. And, oh yeah, they got a carrier. Remember, for like 20 years, they said they'd never have carriers. Then they said they'd have them in 30 or 40 years. And then when they built 3 of them in 10 years, they told us, no, carriers aren't a threat because they're not like ours. So there's this constant chipping away and deflating the threat. And all of this combined is why we're in this position we're in today.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'd say is, when I see, people clinging to aircraft in Afghanistan and Kabul 2.5 years ago, trying to get out and falling off as they're 10,000 or 5,000 feet in the sky, or I see the death and destruction in the Ukraine, or I see the death and destruction in Gaza and in Israel, or the launches of all those missiles. I see it, and I'm asking myself, all these people in Washington that work in the Pentagon, that work in the Foggy Bottom, that work in the National Security Council, they're all these people that are making $150,000, $200,000 a year. Admirals, generals, senior executive service, appointees. There's literally scores of them. There's 4,000 appointees that an administration can make just into the government. Plus all the federal workers are there. We're talking trillions of dollars, and yet nobody could deter any of those acts I just mentioned. This is a problem that we have, a systemic problem that we've forgotten what it means to deter. And that's the reason we created the Pentagon in the first place in 1947, was to ensure that we were never surprised again. And we did pretty well in the Cold War with that structure, but we've lost it since then.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. That's very insightful. Brad, I've noticed China has begun buying land in the United States at a rapid rate. They're buying up food suppliers now. They've tried to infiltrate the U.S. stock market with their Chinese companies. Is China trying to use money and business to slowly overtake the United States, and we're just walking in with a blindfold?
Oh, they are, Stephen, and those are very important illustrations of the problem that we face, which is the Chinese Communist Party is a communist entity, and communists understand political warfare. Political warfare is you use every means at your disposal to destroy your adversary, and that's what they're seeking to do with us. And that means focusing on, if you will, ideological components, focusing on economic components, buying land, right? Demoralizing Americans, right? Taking on the American spirit, taking American, if you will, a sense of nationality and sense of well-being through fentanyl, right? Through marijuana farms. Every element is employed to weaken the United States. Those are small measures, right? Those are big measures. But if we see them, there's the pattern, right? Tucker Carlson is focused on Chinese agents buying marijuana farms in Maine, right? And Stephen, you mentioned the farmland, right? All of this is woven together. An open border where fentanyl, we know that the Chinese Communist Party sponsors businesses that produce the precursors that then ship them over to Mexico, where they essentially are, in the last step, brought into the United States. Well, that's a chemical weapon employed against American citizens, and it should be seen as a chemical weapon. And so wherever we look, whether it's stealing our technology, it's whether the cyber, as Director Wray has warned, right, that they are targeting our infrastructure, our electrical grid. They're targeting Americans as individuals or as groups. Those are all tools that they use because they want to destroy the United States short of kinetic war, right? Which would be an element that they will resort to if they must. But the idea is that America can fall And we'll be at sixes and sevens because of the way we've been demoralized, the way our politics has been undermined, the way our economic system has been undermined, the way our industry, and if you will, our sense of spirit, of Americanness, has been undermined by the CCP. And Stephen, the great irony of that is their success has been considerable, but they're the ones who are illegitimate, right? The Chinese people did not vote for the Chinese Communist Party. They were put in power by the Soviet Union, by the Communist International, who really made them, instructed them, funded them, brought them along, and then Stalin brought them to power, really, and helped to sustain them in power. Chinese people did not vote for this. They are absolutely illegitimate. And yet they're the ones, in so many respects, that have us on the back foot. And the answer to that, why they have us on the back foot, is the engagement school, as Jim identified. The fact that our elites see the CCP not as an enemy, but as a business partner, right? As an entity that isn't truly communist. It's an entity that ensures that the Chinese people will never go on strike, so manufacturing will always be done efficiently and effectively. It's an atrocious situation that must end if we are to save the United States and to save the health and well-being, of course, of the American people and our national security interests at home and abroad.
Yeah. Jim, give me your thoughts on this. I thought that this was really telling. Xi Jinping comes to San Francisco, and suddenly the city has money to clean up the homeless, to clean up the streets, to take down the boarded windows, all as this facade to present ourselves well to Xi Jinping. Biden has a very short meeting where they don't really discuss fentanyl or any of the stuff that China is doing behind the scenes. And then what happens? Biden is basically dismissed and he goes out to dinner with all of the top CEOs. I thought that was very telling. What were your thoughts on that interaction?
Well, before we get to that interaction, you have to put this in the context of that year, this kind of famous year of the return of engagement after the Trump administration. Because remember, in January of 2023, you had this spy balloon from China, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and collection. It was a signals intelligence collection balloon. Let's make no mistake about it. A payload that was massive, that was designed to suck up signals, communications, and electronic intelligence from the United States. Specifically, it looks and appears to be from U.S. military installations as it traipsed across America unresponded to. When that happened, Secretary of State Blinken had already announced that he was going to come to China. And because that got released by an American citizen in Montana, they had to back off and say, I'm going to have to delay my trip right now because I can't come because it's too hot. It wouldn't look good. So what happened in May, we find out that CIA Director Burns made a covert visit to Beijing. Then Blinken went in June. And then 2 weeks later, Secretary of Treasury Yellen went. Then 2 weeks later, Climate Czar Kerry went. And then Henry Kissinger made his last visit of his life at 100 years old. He went. And then in August of that year, Commerce Secretary Raimondo went. And then it culminated with this big, and then Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, went in September. So you have this conga line of cabinet level officials, senior officials going, Newsom, governor of the state, all going to kowtow before, then prostrate themselves, and literally Yellen physically kowtowed and bowed down to her counterparts. And then you have the big meeting in Woodside or in San Francisco area, which, as you say correctly, the only thing that they got out of it, what Biden and his team wanted, is they were begging to resume mill-to-mill communications between our military and their military. And that was the one thing that he came out with and said, now our militaries are going to talk, and so we'll have peace in our time. That's not what he said, but you could have paraphrased it that way. And then you have this dinner with, the millionaires and billionaires of America. And not only did they give him a standing ovation, Xi Jinping, once they gave him 2 standing ovations at that dinner. which was to say, hey, we're glad we're back in business and things are going to be good. And that's really the message that we should take away from that, is that this crowd that got basically pushed out of the government, to some degree, not fully, but to some degree during the Trump years, they were raging back into the engagement school as of basically 2023. So we call it neo-engagement. We're back in this new engagement policy, and it's disastrous because China's going to use that to continue what they did in the previous engagement era before Trump, which is to continue to claim that they're a developing country, so give me more foreign direct investment, but continue to build as a priority their military to threaten everybody in the region to kowtow to them. And so it's a complete disaster that we're returning to this, and there's no objectivity. There's no one in the administration or in the U.S. government that raises their hand and says, why are we doing this? Why is this beneficial? To what empirical measures of effect show us that doing this will be better? It's only on the one measure. There's only one measure, and it's Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, which is if we don't engage with China, it'll be thermonuclear war. So it's either engage or it's thermonuclear war. Whereas in the Cold War, we had, and Brad knows a hell of a lot more about this than I do, we had gradations of escalation in conventional and nuclear arena. It was shades of gray, hundreds of steps. And all of a sudden now, when we deal with the PRC, it's just one or the other, engage or thermonuclear war. And this binary thinking has made it impossible for us to confront China in any way, shape, or form. And it's strangling us, and it's allowing China to take advantage and achieve their goals.
Yeah. Brad, help me understand this. New polling data was just released in the last day on CNN, of all places. They had to admit, when it comes to protecting the country, people see Trump as a better option. When it comes to getting back from inflation, they saw Trump as a better option. World peace, Trump is a better option. But then you have Russia publicly announcing another Biden administration would be much better for Russia, and China saying a Biden administration would be much better for China. Is this because they see his weakness as something that they can exploit? Why the difference in the way the American people feel compared to these foreign leaders?
Well, to my mind, it's quite clear that both Russia and, more importantly, Beijing, China, wants Biden to stay in power because Biden is, leaving aside elements of corruption, the Biden family's corruption, the ties to it's seemingly innumerable governments in international politics, and there are many stories there, of course, that have yet to come to light. But some have already come to light, Stephen, as you well know, about ties between entities in the People's Republic of China and the Biden family. So that is of tremendous concern and is very worrying. But if we leave that aside, it's quite clear that Biden's policies are in accord with what Beijing wants in terms of their grand strategic objectives, because Biden is weak. Biden is not taking the measures necessary to respond actively and vigorously in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere to deal with the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. Biden wants to continue his partnership individually, of course, his families, but also broadly with the American elite and the Chinese Communist Party. So, of course, they would like it. And as Jim and I are fond of saying, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has to thank their lucky stars that they found an American leadership that's been as venal, that's been as corrupt as, sadly, our political leadership has been dating back to the Clintons, where really this horrible, this cancerous element started with Chinese money directly filling coffers in the Democrats. I would add that's a bipartisan problem. It's the Democrats may be egregious, but the Republicans have been only a few steps behind in many respects, and that's a very sad testimony. So it's quite clear to me that Beijing is going to vote in this November 5th election. Stephen, we need to recognize election interference is going to take many forms. And Xi Jinping desperately wants Biden to continue to stay in office, or the Democrat candidate, if Biden decides he wants to spend more time with his family after the convention in August and Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom steps in, right? They would put their thumb, their very weighty thumb on the scale for the Democrat candidate. And election interference can take place in many different forms. As the Taiwanese election showed in January 13th, the CCP interfered in that election, not effectively. But Stephen, when you take the individuals who've crossed over, the Chinese soldiers, intelligence agents who are certain to have crossed over in an open border, you wed that to cyber measures, you wed that to ballot harvesting, you wed that to the fact that the CCP can print ballots. They can print an American ballot that could be distributed and delivered into a Dropbox by a PRC agent operating in the United States. We have to be aware and very cognizant that the forms of election interference are going to be massive, and they're going to take new forms. And the CCP is going to be far more active than they already have been in the past to ensure that Biden or the Democrat candidate wins in November 5th.
Yeah. I read just last night that there were several dozen counties around, especially in the swing states, that had 100% of votes as the population. So way too many voters. And yet when you count the ballot, oh, well, all of the ballots say that Joe Biden won, but we don't know where some of these ballots came from. There's too many ballots, right? So that's something that is going to have to be worked through. Jim, tell me about Embracing Communist China. Why did you write this book? And what are we going to learn by reading it?
Well, first of all, thanks for bringing up the book. And a lot of the credit for the genesis of this, it obviously goes to Brad. He was the brainchild of the concept of this topic of how did we get here to this position of being out of power. And I'm just a practitioner, just a knuckle dragon Navy guy. And so what his academic understanding of how we got here matched up with my own experience in the Navy and in the intelligence community. So it was a kind of a hand in glove collaboration on this. And what you learn from the book is what we said at the beginning is, how is it possible that we didn't perceive that the PRC was going to be this major threat to us, an existential threat, and why didn't we prepare for it? And as I said earlier, there was those three reasons, kind of this historical change, the fact that we had our own greed and avarice and Wall Street, and the fact that Deng Xiaoping played us for suckers. And so those are the three main reasons, and that's what the book talks about. And we talk about the engagement community and how they've infiltrated so much of our government and so much of our thinking. It's just everywhere, in every country that we deal with, every relationship the United States has, our lack of attention to our allies, all kinds of things of that nature. For instance, we talk a lot about in Europe, NATO and this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, that's a great thing, right? It came out of World War II. It's a great way to fight the Soviet Union, which they successfully did. They got problems today, no question about it. I live here in Europe, and there's a lot of problems with NATO, a lot of free riding. But the concept of what NATO was designed to do and create, and what it did in the Cold War, was truthfully successful. But in the Pacific, for some reason, we were told that we were going to have to deal with our allies individually in a hub and spoke relationship, individually. And when uniform, was a big proponent of that. But it was only in the last, since we've working together, we started to question this. Why are we thinking that way? And a large part of it was because of the engagement community. They kept us hogtied, or as Brad says, in a headlock intellectually, to where we were only going to be able to do certain things because we never wanted to provoke China. And so that's really the big message, is we have to get away from talking about provoking China. We need to get back to, what is it required for the United States to stay the United States? How do we have victory to survive against adversaries? And we got a lot of them. And as Brad said, we got to rank order them. And clearly, the PRC is the most deadly enemy that we have today. And as he also said, and we agree on, we don't want to fight. That's not the purpose of this book. The purpose of the book is to tell people to wake them up and shake them and say, you got to wake up about this. And now you got to start taking actions. And the first action is to recognize that you have an adversary that's dedicated to your death and destruction.
Yeah. Wow.
And then you have to take the requisite actions afterwards to do the things that are needed to make sure that you shore up your own defenses and provide a deterrent effect to the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And we haven't done that, and we need to.
Yeah. Steve Bannon from the War Room has told his 40 million subscribers over and over again, China is the big threat. China is the big threat. They will try to take us over without firing a single bullet. And I believe there's a lot of truth to that. But Brad, same question to you. Why did you want to publish Embracing Communist China? And from your perspective, what will we learn?
Well, Jim was far too modest. It was Jim lived this as an intelligence officer, a senior intelligence officer in the United States Navy. He saw the growth of the threat and he tried to warn about it, and it cost him mightily. So a small number of individuals saw this and tried to warn about it, and they were penalized greatly for so doing. So why did I write this, right? Well, Jim and I wrote it because we were motivated by the same concern. First, we recognized something remarkable happened that nobody discusses openly. The People's Republic of China went from, in 1990, Stephen, about 0.6% of world gross domestic product, so not even 1%, to in 2019 about 18 or 19%, right before COVID. So in 30 years, China went from nothing to about 1/5, roughly 1/5 of world gross domestic product. All right, that's a remarkable rise in international politics, which is a very rare event. Bismarck's Germany did that. The Japanese, after Meiji Restoration, also had similar rises with disastrous results. Unlike those two cases, Bismarck's Germany or Japan, right? A unique occurrence has happened in international politics. The US didn't balance against its enemy, right? The first rule of international politics is that you see an enemy and you balance against him. You see a threat coming and you take measures to safeguard yourself and your national security interests. And we didn't. And that has to be explained. It has to be explained to the American people today, but it also has to be explained to our fathers and mothers, our grandfathers and grandmothers who made the sacrifices of the Cold War, right? The 36,000 Americans killed in Korea, 58,000 Americans killed, all casualties in Vietnam, right? The individuals who served facing the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, who gave their lives in conflicts all over the world, right? They gave us an incredible gift that was American dominance with the defeat of the Soviet Union in 1991. That should have gone on for 50 years. That should have gone on maybe for a century. And what happens? Stephen, our elites blew it, right? Our elites took money and they enriched themselves and they bought another yacht and they bought the 10th retirement home and ensured that they were well off and their families are well off, but they sacrificed American national security and our birthrights, what our fathers, our mothers, our grandmothers, grandfathers sacrificed, and the world they gave us, right? Starting with Bill Clinton, they blew, they just wasted it. And they worked with a communist enemy to weaken the United States, and they brought us to where we are today. So that helped to motivate us to generate this book. And we would expect your audience also to be similarly, to ask those questions. Well, how did this happen? How is it that what we had was lost, and for what end? And to the benefit of which communities, which groups, which people who profited handsomely while East Palestine, Ohio sacrificed, right? Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, we can go down list of American manufacturing centers that paid the price and American communities that paid the price. So Americans should be outraged that we embrace Chinese communist China, and we should demand that we change, as we do have the recommendations. And Jim, of course, having lived it, was absolutely key. It was his experience that really helped, heavily informed our recommendations about what we need to do to get out of this mess.
Okay. Wow. I'm excited to share this with my community, help them wake up. You know, I try to cover the topic of China and how they're trying to infiltrate on my show as often as I can. I mean, just the fact that they're subsidizing the chemicals that go into fentanyl that kills over 100,000 Americans a year. I mean, by the time Biden is out of office, hopefully in 4 years, that'll be almost as many deaths as Americans in World War II. And nobody seems to care about that. We just move on with our life. Our government occasionally brings it up, but more needs to be done. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for spending this morning with me and helping my community better understand this. I'm going to put a direct link to Embracing Communist China down below so people can learn more about it and purchase it. But thank you both for coming on. Continue to raise your voices, get the word out. Hopefully more and more shows will have you guys on so that Americans can understand this. But thank you both so much for coming on, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the opportunity. We greatly enjoyed the chance to reach your audience. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Jim, as well.
Really appreciate it. Good conversation.